Hey, Tim Frisch with A Frisch Perspective here. I did some videos recently talking about some feedback that I had on a portion of a sermon by John MacArthur, and just was conveying some of my thoughts, especially in relationship to how we as Christians view politics and the way that we frame things in political situations. And I understand it's a topic that we have a lot of different opinions about, and really my point was just for us always to make sure we evaluate ourselves in light of Scripture. I got a lot of feedback from those videos. Some people understood exactly where I was coming from and agreed with me. Other people really disagreed with me and felt maybe I was just really attacking John MacArthur. I don't have any problem with someone being forthright about sin or calling out moral issues, but I want to show one comment that really spurred me on to the subject of this video, which is talking about sins in the Republican sphere of politics, if we want to put it that way. What are some sins on the right side politically in America? This commenter said, saying it in a nice way, the way that John MacArthur framed it was at the beginning he said we could talk about the economy, etc., but he is drawing the line on morality. Unless you point out morality issues with the Republicans, you are making a very weak point. John MacArthur is drawing the line on morality issues. So I thought that was actually a really excellent comment, and it's true. Drawing the line on morality issues is something that needs to be done, and I'm in favor of that. I have no problem even being forthright about certain issues. I think we should be. But as I think about all of the political things going on in our country, I think it's also important to be forthright about sins on every side of politics. And so if we are on the right side, conservative side of things, I think we have to really take a look at sins. Now, I just want to say here that really as I talk about this, I'm not actually coming at it so much from a political standpoint. I'm really trying to approach this from a Christian standpoint. What I mean by that is I think it's going to sound to people like as I criticize the conservative side of things, Republican-oriented things, that I'm really trying to uphold the Democratic side. And a lot of people seem to think that in what I said in the other videos, and that's not what I'm doing. I'm actually trying to say, as a Christian, looking at it through a scriptural framework, what are the sins that we see even on the side of, say, Republicans? And I think that's really important. It's important for us. It helps us to be honest. It helps us to be humble. It helps us actually to speak with greater moral clarity if we can look at not only the sins of another side politically, but if we happen to be on one side politically, to see our own tendencies and wrongdoings. I also know that as I talk about this, a lot of people are going to be defensive, and that's pretty normal if you're pointing out something on their side. I just ask, though, take a look at Scripture with me and think about it for yourself. I'm not judging anybody. I'm asking us to really look at ourselves before God and allow God to judge us. I think what MacArthur's talking about, God judging this nation, I understand what he's saying. And personally, I think the judgment comes in a lot of directions. In other words, there are a lot of reasons that God could judge us as a people and will judge us as a people. And it's not just from one political standpoint. I think there is a lot of sin really in the whole political system. And so all of us deserve judgment, is my view on that. But let's look at some of the sins here, biblically speaking, that you might see more on the Republican side of the political spectrum. So the first thing that I want to point out has to do with the topic of greed, which is definitely something we should acknowledge is a biblical sin when we're talking about greed. Jesus said, "Do not lay up for yourselves treasures on earth, where moth and rust destroy, and where thieves break in and steal, but lay up for yourselves treasures in heaven, where neither moth nor rust destroys, and where thieves do not break in and steal. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also." So Jesus is clearly talking here about not putting our investments in this world. We want to be laying up treasures in heaven. But it is a tendency for humans to store up things for themselves on this earth. And even we as Christians can fall into this. It's interesting, too, that Jesus talked about in Luke chapter 16 the subject of money. And the commentary there in Luke 16:14 is that the Pharisees who were lovers of money, heard all these things, and they ridiculed Jesus. So the Pharisees, one of the issues that they had with him, one of the reasons they were against him is because they were lovers of money, and they didn't like everything that he had to say about money. He went on a little bit further in this passage to talk about the story of the rich man and Lazarus, which is an interesting story. I won't get into that now, but the real point here is that the Pharisees, one of their sinful characteristics is that they were lovers of money. Speaking of that, in 1 Timothy chapter 6, Paul is talking about this to Timothy, a leader in the church, and he says that those who desire to be rich fall into temptation, into a snare, into many senseless and harmful desires that plunge people into ruin and destruction. For the love of money is a root of all kinds of evils. It is through this craving that some have wandered away from the faith and pierced themselves through with many pangs. So it seems clear to me in Scripture that the love of money is a real problem. And so money in and of itself can be a really dangerous thing for us spiritually. I think that's pretty clear in everything that I pointed out here from Scripture. So that's really the first thing that I just want us all to think about. I think it's important for us to evaluate is the issue of greed. Now, there are certainly greedy people on both sides of the political spectrum. But what I think is fascinating and really important here is that when we talk about capitalism, and just to put my cards on the table, I am more in favor of capitalism myself. I'm not in favor of socialism. That's my political standpoint personally. But that being said, capitalism can have this tendency to have business models which are encouraged to promote sin and are actually rewarded for promoting sin, because the aim in capitalism is to make money. So you have to admit there are a lot of things happening in our culture right now that are being exacerbated by the desire to make money. And these are very sinful things. And the motivation behind it is money making. And capitalism actually supports that. In and of itself, it says, you can be rewarded if you do something that people want, and they buy from you what they want. So there are a lot of examples of this, but if we take even the news business right now, which many of us are critical of, one of the reasons that the news is such a problem right now is that the news is able to make money. They are able to capitalize on dissension and misinformation. So that kind of shows you. Now, I know a lot of people are going to say, yeah, but that's humans that take that. That is absolutely right. But that's my point, is that the Republican side of things can actually reward those behaviors. It's not the intent, it's not our purpose, but that is the upshot of our political view, is that it can actually reward bad behavior. And we're seeing that right now in our culture. We could see it in other places too, like the music industry, and that some artists are actually rewarded for putting out some really morally reprehensible things because they'll make a lot of money putting that stuff out there. So there's the music industry. There's also social media. And I love what I heard from a YouTuber the other day who was talking about how in social media we monetize rage. What an excellent statement, that we actually make money off of people's rage. So I really think when you are emphasizing the capitalist side of things and you're promoting that, you have these very real issues. And really, again, I want to reiterate it. The point I'm making is not that capitalism tells you have to do bad things. However, it is very easy for the system to reward those bad things. And I think that in and of itself is sinful. Also, the aim of capitalism is for us to make money. And again, what Jesus in the Scripture is talking about here is we need to be really careful about how we view money, how we prioritize money in our lives, and how we use it. So I think that's a really important issue for us to examine and look at, is the issue of greed. Another one would be pride. I think that the issue of pride, it's like a lot of things. It's an issue of degrees. It's one thing to look up to someone and to admire them, but there is a difference between looking up to someone and actually idolizing them. And I think that's true in a lot of ways in our lives. It's just the degree by which we do something in which it becomes a sin. And I think that's where pride can seep in. And you think about, we as Americans, there's a level in which I would say I really do love America and I'm proud of America. But at what point does that become a sin in the way that we look at our country, and we become very proud about it in really a sinful way? And I think we have to be honest that we can seep into wrong ways of viewing our country and our culture and become very proud about it. And therefore, I think that really is an issue that I think is on both sides politically, but sometimes it's actually bolstered on the right. And we actually say we want to be proud of being American in a way that, we really have to question, is that a good thing? Are we doing it in a really Christ-like biblical way? And I'm not sure I'm expressing this extremely clearly. There's probably a lot of examples we could look at on the issue of pride. Again, money plays into that, because the more money you have, the more you acquire. It's easy to become very proud without even realizing it, that you have so much. And we know that that's an issue for us as humans, that when we have a lot, we become very self-sufficient, very proud. And so that's something we have to watch for too, especially on the values that are promoted by the right politically. And one other issue that I'll bring up, and I'm not saying that these are the only sins that we might see on the right, but these are the tendencies that I see that I think these stand out a lot. And the third one would actually be hatred. And again, there is a lot of times a good side to things, or a good aspect to things. I think, for example, we should be opposed to certain things, but there's a difference between being opposed to an idea and actually that seeping into hating people. I think of what Jesus said, actually, how he says we've been taught to love our neighbor but hate our enemy. But he says that actually he's telling us to love our enemies and to pray for them. And that's something we have to take a look at. Do we really love the people that we would consider in a different viewpoint and even live a different lifestyle than what we believe in? Do we really love those people? I notice that on Facebook, for example, I'll see people that I think are probably considered very upstanding Christians in general. People would say, yeah, they seem like a good, godly person. But sometimes they'll post things that clearly come across as derogatory and even hateful in the way that they portray certain people. So, for example, I've seen posts that actually tease gay people. And then in contrast to that, I actually heard a Christian man who had lived for like 20 years in LA as a gay man, and he came to know the Lord. And it was because of some Christians who actually lovingly took some time to talk to him, and then they invited him to church. He went to church, and his first time at church, he was exposed to the gospel, and his life was changed. He no longer identifies as a gay person, but he still talks about the gay community, and he talks about having compassion for them. And I think that's something that can really be missing in a lot of people's lives, is compassion. And I just think, don't we realize that God had to be so merciful to us for any sins that we have? Can't we convey that same mercy and compassion toward others, even as we do rightly point out sin? A lot of the things that I'm talking about here too are hard to pinpoint from the outside. I think that's what's so awesome about Jesus, is that he actually went past the exterior and he went to the heart, and he said, you need to look at your heart, and your heart needs to be evaluated honestly before God. And the Pharisees, for example, did look good on the outside. That didn't make them good people. Jesus was able to see through that. So I think with the right side politically, it can be the same way at times, where things can look good on the outside, but we really have to examine our hearts. And things like greed and pride and hatred may not be super obvious at first glance, but they're things that really are an issue. And by the way, they really feed into the sinful tendencies of our culture and the direction of our culture. And we can actually be part of that without even realizing it. So I hope what I'm saying here expresses clearly what I'm talking about when I talk about evaluating sins from all different sides, and not just seeing and coming down really harshly in one direction and then maybe not seeing sins on our own side. I'm not saying MacArthur does that. I know MacArthur, if you look at his ministry as a whole, he definitely talks about the same kinds of sins I'm talking about here. What I'm saying, though, is that in practice, what we can do as Christians is really get hyped up and harsh about certain sins and then kind of ignore other sins. And that's what I think we really need to be careful about. I think that probably expresses a lot more clearly what I've been thinking about and trying to say, but probably haven't been clear enough in what I've said before. So I'd like to hear what you think about all of this, and if you do agree with me, it does definitely encourage me to hear when you agree, and I thank you for those who agree. I don't mind people disagreeing, but again, try to keep your comments constructive and helpful, edifying to our discussion. But thank you so much for taking some time to listen to some of my thoughts from a Frisch Perspective.